They built the first cities before the world had a name for civilization. Picture this. 5,500 years ago, while most of humanity still wandered in scattered tribes, something extraordinary happened in the muddy delta between two rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates carved their way through Mesopotamia, leaving behind rich black soil that would change everything. Here, in this swampy wasteland that floods called home, a people we now call the Sumerians began an experiment that had never been tried before. They built Uruk, not a village, not a settlement, a city. The first true city in human history. Stand with me now in the ruins of ancient Uruk, in what is today southern Iraq. Feel the wind cutting across these broken walls and try to imagine what stood here when this place was alive. When Uruk reached its peak around 3,200 BCE, it sprawled across 6 square kilometers of packed earth and towering brick. 40,000 people lived within these walls. 40,000, a number that sounds modest today, but represented something impossible just centuries before. This was the moment when humans stopped merely surviving and started building something larger than themselves. The Sumerians didn't just create the first city. They invented the very idea of urban civilization. But how does a scattered collection of farmers and herders transform into the architects of humanity's first great leap forward? The answer lies in the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates were not gentle streams. They were forces of nature, unpredictable, violent, and absolutely essential. Every spring, snowmelt from the distant mountains sent torrents of water racing toward the Persian Gulf. The floods came without warning, washing away crops, drowning settlements, reshaping the entire landscape overnight. For early peoples, this was catastrophe. For the Sumerians, it became opportunity. They learned to tame the water. Picture teams of workers, thousands of them, moving earth with nothing but bronze tools and human muscle. They dug canals that stretched for kilometers, channeling flood water into vast irrigation networks that could water fields even in the driest seasons. They built dikes and levees, turning chaos into control. This wasn't just engineering. It was the birth of organized labor, centralized planning, and social hierarchy. Because someone had to be in charge. Managing irrigation systems required coordination on a scale never before attempted. Farmers upstream had to cooperate with farmers downstream. Water rights had to be allocated fairly. Disputes had to be resolved. The old tribal councils couldn't handle this complexity. They needed something new: permanent leadership, professional administration, government. Enter the Lugal, literally big man in Sumerian. These were the world's first kings, though they didn't start with that title. Initially, they were simply war leaders, chosen during crises. But crisis in Sumer was constant. River management, defense against raiders, competition with neighboring settlements. The temporary became permanent. The Lugal became king. And kings needed palaces. Walk through the archaeological layers of Uruk, and you can trace this transformation. The earliest levels show simple mud brick houses clustered around shrines. But as you move up through time, the architecture grows more ambitious. Larger buildings, thicker walls, and rising above everything else, the first ziggurats, artificial mountains of brick that announce to anyone within 50 kilometers that something powerful lived here. These weren't just impressive buildings. They were statements of intent. The Ziggurat of Uruk, dedicated to the sky god Anu, stood 60 meters high, a skyscraper by ancient standards. Its construction required organizing thousands of workers, managing complex supply chains, and coordinating construction techniques that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. This was civilization flexing its muscles. But the real revolution wasn't architectural, it was intellectual. Around 3200 BCE, in the administrative offices of Uruk's temples, Sumerian scribes began making marks on clay tablets that would change human consciousness forever. They invented writing, not decorative symbols, not artistic representations. True writing, a system that could capture human speech and preserve it across time and space. They started with simple record-keeping, grain stores, livestock counts, property ownership. But once you can write down numbers, you can write down names. Once you can write down names, you can write down stories. Once you can write down stories, you can write down laws. The implications hit immediately. For the first time in human history, knowledge could accumulate across generations without it relying on memory. Complex legal codes became possible. Historical records became possible. Literature became possible. The Sumerians had unlocked the future. Within centuries, Uruk wasn't alone. Ur rose on the banks of the Euphrates, its massive ziggurat and royal cemetery proclaiming its wealth and power. Lagash emerged as a military powerhouse, its armies reaching deep into neighboring territories. Nippur became the religious center, home to Enlil, king of the gods. Eridu, claiming to be the oldest city on earth, maintained its status as a center of learning and tradition. Each city-state developed its own character, its own ambitions, its own version of what civilization should look like. They traded with each other, learned from each other, and, inevitably, fought with each other. The very success that made them possible also made conflict inevitable. More people meant more resources needed. Better technology meant better weapons. Stronger governments meant stronger armies. The Sumerians had created something that had never existed before: organized warfare between sophisticated states. Picture the armies of early Sumer marching across the floodplains between cities. Not the chaotic raids of tribal warriors, but disciplined formations of professional soldiers. They carried bronze-tipped spears and battle axes. They wore copper helmets and leather armor. They moved in phalanxes that could punch through enemy lines and hold ground against counterattacks. Most importantly, they built war chariots. The Sumerian battle cart wasn't the elegant two-wheeled chariot that would later dominate ancient warfare. It was a four-wheeled platform pulled by onagers, wild asses, that served as a mobile command post and weapons platform. Archaeological evidence from the royal cemetery at Ur shows us exactly what these machines looked like: heavy, imposing, designed to break enemy morale as much as enemy lines. War drove innovation. Competition forced excellence. The city-states pushed each other to new heights of achievement, each trying to outbuild, out-organize, and out-fight their neighbors. The result was a flowering of human capability unlike anything the world had ever seen. By 2800 BCE, Sumerian civilization had established the template that would define urban life for millennia. They had kings and subjects, priests and merchants, soldiers and craftsmen. They had laws and taxes, schools and libraries, markets and temples. They had created specialization on a scale that freed individuals to become experts in narrow fields, driving innovation in everything from metallurgy to mathematics. They had also created inequality on a scale never before possible. The palace and temple complexes of mature Sumerian cities housed thousands of bureaucrats, priests, and servants living lives of relative comfort, while farmers and laborers worked in conditions that would have seemed harsh even by the standards of earlier, simpler societies. This wasn't an accident. It was the cost of complexity. Advanced civilization required some people to be freed from basic survival tasks, and that freedom came at the expense of others. But the Sumerians weren't content with building impressive cities and efficient governments. They wanted to understand their place in the universe. They developed sophisticated systems of astronomy and mathematics. They created the first schools where young scribes learned not just practical skills, but literature and philosophy. They wrote down their myths and legends, preserving stories that would influence human culture for thousands of years. Most importantly, they began to see themselves as part of something larger than their individual city-states. They shared a common language, common gods, common cultural practices. They were becoming, almost accidentally, the world's first civilization in the modern sense, a cultural system that transcended political boundaries and could survive the rise and fall of individual kingdoms. This was humanity's childhood ending and its adolescence beginning. The Sumerians had learned to build. Now they would learn to fight. The temple rose from the heart of Nippur like a man-made mountain, its stepped sides climbing toward heaven in perfectly calculated tiers. At its summit, in a shrine no larger than a modern bedroom, lived the most powerful being in the Sumerian world. Not a king, not a general, a god. Enlil, Lord of the Hurricane, Father of Destinies, the deity who had separated heaven from earth and given breath to the first humans. To understand the Sumerians, you must understand this. Their gods weren't distant, abstract forces. They were neighbors, literally. Each major deity owned property, collected taxes, employed servants, and made political decisions that affected thousands of lives. The line between divine and human authority wasn't just blurred, it was intentionally erased. This was theocracy perfected. Walk through the ruins of any major Sumerian city, and the pattern becomes clear. The largest, most impressive building is always the temple complex. Not the royal palace, though that's substantial too. The temple. These weren't just places of worship. They were economic powerhouses that owned vast estates, controlled trade networks, and employed armies of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and laborers. The temple of Inanna in Uruk, goddess of love and war, controlled over a third of the city's agricultural land. Its archives record transactions involving thousands of cattle, millions of liters of grain, and trade agreements stretching from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Iran. This single religious institution wielded more economic power than most modern corporations. But the real genius of the Sumerian system wasn't economic. It was psychological. Consider the position of a Sumerian king. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs, who claimed to be gods themselves, Sumerian rulers positioned themselves as servants of the gods. They were ensi, meaning governor or priest-king, appointed by divine will to manage earthly affairs on behalf of celestial masters. This created a remarkably stable form of government. Revolution against a king was rebellion against the gods themselves. The mythology supported this structure perfectly. Sumerian creation stories didn't feature heroic gods conquering chaos through strength. Instead, they described a cosmic bureaucracy where each deity had specific responsibilities and clear hierarchical relationships. Anu ruled the heavens, Enlil controlled the air and storms, Enki managed the waters and human wisdom. Below them, dozens of lesser gods handled everything from grain production to military victory to the administration of justice. Humans in this cosmology were created as workers, not metaphorically, literally. The Epic of Atrahasis describes the gods growing tired of maintaining the universe themselves and deciding to create humans as their servants. We weren't made in divine image as free beings, but as living tools designed to feed the gods through sacrifice and serve them through labor. This wasn't depressing theology, it was liberating politics. If humans were meant to serve, then social hierarchy became natural law. If gods required constant attention, then massive temple complexes became religious necessity. If divine will determined earthly events, then kings ruled by unquestionable right. The system produced extraordinary stability. Unlike later civilizations where royal succession often triggered civil wars, Sumerian city-states developed smooth mechanisms for transferring power. When a king died, the gods simply chose another servant. The transition was managed by priests who interpreted divine will through omens, dreams, and complex divination rituals that, coincidentally, usually confirmed the most politically expedient choice. But stability came with a price: conformity. Sumerian society allowed remarkably little individual expression. Art followed rigid conventions that changed slowly over centuries. Architecture adhered to temple-approved patterns. Even personal names reflected religious devotion. Ur-Nammu means servant of Nammu. Gudea translates as called by the god. Citizens weren't expected to think independently about ultimate questions. The gods had already provided all necessary answers. This conformity enabled unprecedented coordination. When the temple of Enlil in Nippur decided to construct a new ziggurat, the project mobilized resources from dozens of city-states. Kings who spent most of their time fighting each other collaborated willingly on religious construction. Merchants who competed ruthlessly in secular trade shared information freely when divine interests were involved. The gods provided a unifying force that transcended political boundaries. The divine system also produced Sumer's greatest intellectual achievements. Temple schools, originally created to train priests and scribes, became the world's first institutions of higher learning. Students didn't just memorize religious texts, they studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. The requirement that priests understand complex religious calendars drove innovations in mathematical calculation. The need to interpret divine will through natural phenomena pushed forward systematic observation of celestial movements. Most importantly, the gods demanded stories. Sumerian religious practice centered on elaborate festivals that retold mythological events through drama, music, and ritual. These weren't simple ceremonies. They were sophisticated theatrical productions that could last for days and involve entire city populations. To stage them effectively, priests needed detailed written scripts. To make them memorable, they needed compelling narratives. To keep them fresh, they needed creative elaboration. The result was the world's first literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, probably composed around 2100 BCE, wasn't just entertainment. It was theology disguised as adventure story. Its hero was Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, who supposedly ruled around 2700 BCE. Historical records suggest a real king named Gilgamesh did exist, but the epic transformed him into something larger, humanity's first literary protagonist. The story follows Gilgamesh's journey from arrogant tyrant to wise ruler, focusing on his friendship with the wild man Enkidu and his quest for immortality after Enkidu's death. But beneath the adventure narrative lies sophisticated religious philosophy. Gilgamesh represents human ambition and its limitations. Enkidu embodies the tension between civilization and nature. Their friendship explores the costs and benefits of urban life. The quest for immortality confronts the reality of human mortality in a universe controlled by gods who view humans as expendable servants. This wasn't mythology in the modern sense, stories told for entertainment or cultural identity. It was applied theology, religious doctrine presented through compelling narrative that made abstract concepts emotionally accessible to ordinary citizens. The epic also served political purposes. By casting Gilgamesh as both hero and cautionary tale, it reinforced the idea that even the greatest kings were subject to divine authority. By showing the gods as powerful but not always wise or just, it prepared citizens to accept that life under divine rule might involve considerable suffering. By emphasizing the importance of friendship and community, it encouraged social cohesion that benefited the ruling class. Other Sumerian myths served similar functions. The story of Inanna's descent into the underworld explained seasonal cycles while reinforcing gender roles. The flood narrative, preserved in the Epic of Atrahasis, provided theological justification for natural disasters while emphasizing the importance of obedience to divine will. The creation story explained human purpose while establishing the legitimacy of social hierarchy. But the gods weren't just political tools, they were economic engines. Temple complexes functioned as banks, lending seed grain to farmers and collecting interest at harvest time. They operated workshops that produced textiles, metalwork, and luxury goods for both local use and international trade. They maintained schools that trained the scribes and administrators essential to Sumerian bureaucracy. They sponsored the research that advanced Sumerian technology and learning. Most lucratively, they controlled long-distance trade. Sumer lacked many essential resources: no metal ore, no quality stone, no timber suitable for large construction projects. Everything had to be imported from regions hundreds of kilometers away, often through territories controlled by hostile peoples. This required sophisticated logistics, reliable communication networks, and, most importantly, trusted partners at both ends of the trade routes. Religious authority provided that trust. A merchant traveling under temple sponsorship carried divine protection that transcended political boundaries. Contracts witnessed by priests had supernatural enforcement that went beyond legal sanctions. Trade agreements made in the names of gods were literally sacred commitments that breaking would invite cosmic retribution. The temples became Sumer's first multinational corporations with branch offices throughout the known world. Temple records from Kanesh in central Turkey describe complex financial arrangements between Sumerian religious institutions and local merchants that enabled trade networks stretching from India to the Mediterranean. These weren't simple buying and selling relationships. They were comprehensive economic partnerships that financed everything from caravan protection to technological development. The profits flowed back to Sumer in the form of unprecedented prosperity. By 2500 BCE, even ordinary citizens of major Sumerian cities enjoyed living standards that wouldn't be matched in most parts of the world for thousands of years. They had access to manufactured goods from dozens of different regions, professional medical care, formal education for their children, and legal protections that applied regardless of social status. They also had the world's first organized sports leagues, public festivals, and entertainment industries. The gods, it turned out, enjoyed a good time. But the divine system contained the seeds of its own transformation. As city-states grew larger and more powerful, their kings began to chafe at the limitations of serving as mere divine administrators. Why should earthly rulers defer to heavenly authority when earthly rulers commanded real armies and controlled actual resources? The answer came from an unexpected source: war. When city-states fought each other, victory supposedly went to whichever side had divine favor. But what happened when the gods' chosen people lost battles to enemies with inferior gods? What happened when righteous kings suffered defeats at the hands of obvious sinners? What happened when the entire theological system failed to match observable reality? The Sumerians were about to find out. Uruk didn't just grow, it exploded. Between 3500 and 3000 BCE, this single city transformed from a collection of farming villages into the largest urban center on Earth. At its peak, Uruk covered 6 square kilometers and housed over 50,000 people, a population density that wouldn't be matched anywhere else for over 1,000 years. To put this in perspective, while most of humanity still lived in settlements of a few hundred people, Uruk was building the equivalent of a modern metropolitan area. The secret wasn't location, though Uruk sat at the intersection of major trade routes. It wasn't resources, though the surrounding farmland was exceptionally fertile. It wasn't even military power, though Uruk's armies would eventually dominate southern Mesopotamia. The secret was innovation. Uruk became great because its people invented the future. Start with the obvious breakthrough: writing. Around 3200 BCE, Sumerian administrators in Uruk created the world's first writing system, not to preserve literature or record history, but to solve a practical problem. The city had grown too large and too complex for anyone to manage through memory alone. Temple officials needed to track thousands of workers, monitor vast grain stores, coordinate trade expeditions, and maintain diplomatic relationships with dozens of other cities. The old system of knots, tokens, and oral agreements simply couldn't handle the complexity. So they started making marks on clay. The earliest tablets from Uruk are gloriously mundane: payroll records, inventory lists, tax assessments. But within generations, those simple accounting marks had evolved into something revolutionary. The scribes discovered they could use their symbols not just to represent objects, but to capture the sounds of spoken language. Once they could write down sounds, they could write down anything: laws, stories, contracts, letters, prayers, complaints, jokes. The implications rippled outward immediately. Legal disputes could now be resolved by consulting written records rather than relying on witness testimony that might be faulty or biased. Commercial agreements could specify terms too complex for oral negotiation. Technical knowledge could be preserved and transmitted across generations without degradation. Government could operate through permanent institutions rather than depending on the personal qualities of individual rulers. Most importantly, writing enabled Uruk to coordinate activities on a scale never before attempted. The city's massive construction projects, ziggurats, city walls, canal systems, required organizing thousands of workers with different skills, managing supply chains that stretched across hundreds of kilometers, and maintaining quality control over decades-long construction schedules. Without written records to track progress, assign responsibilities, and preserve technical specifications, these projects would have been impossible. But writing was just the beginning. Uruk's real advantage was systemic innovation. Consider the pottery wheel, invented in Uruk around 3500 BCE. This wasn't just a better way to make pots, it was the first step toward mass production. A skilled potter using a wheel could produce in one day what had previously taken a week. More importantly, wheel-made pottery was uniform in ways that hand-built pottery never could be. Standard sizes meant better stacking and storage. Consistent wall thickness meant more reliable performance. Predictable shapes meant more efficient packing for transport. The implications extended far beyond pottery. Standardization enabled specialization. If every potmaker produced containers of identical size, merchants could develop standard measuring systems. If every metalworker produced tools of predictable quality, farmers could plan their work around reliable equipment. If every builder used materials of consistent dimensions, architects could design structures that wouldn't collapse from accumulated variation. Uruk was discovering the power of precision. The city's workshops became laboratories for technological development. Metalworkers experimented with bronze alloys, discovering combinations that produced harder tools and more durable weapons. Textile workers developed new weaving techniques that created stronger fabrics and more complex patterns. Jewelers mastered techniques for working with precious stones and metals that wouldn't be rediscovered elsewhere for centuries. Most impressively, Uruk's architects and engineers solved problems that wouldn't be addressed again until the Roman Empire. The city's walls, built around 2900 BCE, stretched for 9 kilometers and stood 15 meters high. Constructing them required moving over 1 million tons of earth and brick, an engineering project comparable to building a modern dam. The walls incorporated sophisticated defensive features, projecting towers, multiple gates with interlocking fields of fire, and internal passages that allowed defenders to move between positions without exposure to enemy attack. But the walls weren't just impressive. They were necessary. Because Uruk's success was creating enemies, as the city grew larger and more prosperous, it began to dominate the region through economic pressure rather than military conquest. Uruk's workshops could produce goods more efficiently than smaller cities. Its merchants could offer better prices and more reliable delivery. Its schools could train administrators and scribes that other cities desperately needed. Gradually, surrounding settlements found themselves economically dependent on Uruk for everything from manufactured goods to technical expertise. This was the world's first experience with economic imperialism, and the results were predictable. Dependent cities resented their subordination. Independent cities feared losing their autonomy. Neighboring regions worried about Uruk's growing influence over their trade routes and political relationships. By 2900 BCE, Uruk faced a coalition of enemies, determined to break its dominance before it became overwhelming. The solution was military innovation on the same scale as Uruk's civilian achievements. Uruk's army wasn't just larger than its enemies, it was fundamentally different. While other cities still relied on citizen soldiers who fought part-time between farming seasons, Uruk created professional military units that trained year-round and fought with standardized equipment. Its soldiers carried bronze-tipped spears, manufactured to identical specifications. They wore armor produced in city workshops according to established patterns. They fought in formations that had been practiced until every movement was automatic. Most importantly, they had logistical support that enabled sustained campaigns far from home. Uruk could field armies that remained in the field for months rather than weeks, supplied by organized wagon trains that followed predetermined routes between supply depots. This meant Uruk could conduct sieges, occupy territory, and project power across distances that made effective resistance extremely difficult. The crown jewel of Uruk's military technology was the battle cart, a four-wheeled vehicle pulled by onagers that served as mobile command post, weapons platform, and psychological warfare tool. Archaeological evidence shows these machines were elaborately decorated with metal ornaments and religious symbols designed to intimidate enemies and boost the morale of friendly forces. But they were also practical military equipment, elevated platforms that gave commanders better battlefield visibility, mobile arsenals that carried extra weapons and arrows, and breakthrough units that could punch holes in enemy lines. By 2800 BCE, Uruk had used this military technological combination to establish dominance over most of southern Mesopotamia. But dominance created new problems that success had never posed before. How do you govern an empire when the very concept of empire doesn't yet exist? Uruk's rulers faced challenges that no human beings had ever confronted. They controlled dozens of cities with different languages, customs, and religious traditions. They administered territories that stretched across hundreds of kilometers, connected by communication networks that took weeks to transmit messages. They commanded armies large enough to conquer cities, but too small to occupy all their conquests simultaneously. The solution was administrative genius. Instead of replacing local authorities with Uruk officials, the city created a system of supervised autonomy. Conquered cities kept their traditional rulers, but those rulers became vassals who owed tribute, military service, and diplomatic obedience to Uruk. Local laws remained in effect, but serious crimes and political disputes were referred to Uruk courts. Local gods continued to receive worship. But Uruk's gods were recognized as supreme deities with ultimate authority over regional affairs. This wasn't tolerance, it was sophisticated control. By preserving local traditions while inserting Uruk authority at key decision points, the system minimized resistance while maximizing extractable resources. Vassal cities continued to feel autonomous while actually serving Uruk interests. Local populations kept their familiar customs while gradually adopting Uruk cultural practices that made integration easier. The administrative system required unprecedented bureaucratic sophistication. Uruk developed standardized record-keeping systems that tracked tribute payments, military obligations, and political relationships across its entire sphere of influence. It trained corps of administrators who could work effectively in different cultural contexts while maintaining loyalty to Uruk interests. It created communication networks that could coordinate policy across vast distances, despite the limitations of ancient transportation technology. Most remarkably, Uruk managed to make imperial domination seem mutually beneficial. Vassal cities gained access to Uruk's superior technology, educational institutions, and trade networks. Their merchants could operate under Uruk protection throughout the empire. Their young people could receive advanced training in Uruk schools. Their armies could participate in Uruk military campaigns that offered opportunities for plunder and glory that independent action could never provide. This was civilization learning to expand beyond the boundaries of a single city. But expansion brought contact with peoples who had very different ideas about how the world should work. To the north and east, mountain peoples watched Uruk's growing power with increasing alarm. These weren't primitive barbarians. They were sophisticated societies with their own technologies, military traditions, and imperial ambitions. They had been content to trade with Sumerian city-states when those cities remained relatively weak and divided. But a unified southern Mesopotamia under Uruk leadership posed an existential threat to their independence. To the west, nomadic peoples who had maintained profitable relationships with individual Sumerian cities found themselves excluded from Uruk's increasingly controlled trade networks. Where they had once been partners, they were now potential enemies whose presence threatened imperial security. To the south, the Persian Gulf cities that had grown rich facilitating trade between Sumer and distant regions suddenly found themselves competing with Uruk's own merchants, who could offer better terms because they didn't need to pay intermediary profits. By 2700 BCE, Uruk controlled the most powerful state that had ever existed, commanded military forces that could defeat any known enemy, and administered an empire that generated unprecedented wealth and prosperity for its citizens. It also faced a growing coalition of enemies who understood that Uruk's continued expansion would mean their eventual extinction as independent peoples. The stage was set for the first great war in human history. The clay tablet sits in the British Museum today, covered in wedge-shaped marks that most visitors walk past without a second glance. But those marks record something extraordinary. The world's first imperial census, ordered by King Lugalzagesi of Umma around 2350 BCE. The numbers tell a story of unprecedented ambition. 65 cities under direct control, tribute flowing from territories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, armies totaling over 50,000 professional soldiers. Lugalzagesi had done something no human being had ever done before. He had conquered an empire. Not just a large kingdom or an extended city-state, but a true empire, a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-regional political system that imposed unified control over peoples who had never wanted to be unified. For the first time in history, a single human being could give orders that would be obeyed by millions of other human beings across thousands of square kilometers of territory. The road to empire had been paved with brilliant military innovation and ruthless political calculation. Lugalzagesi began his career as Ensi of Umma, a mid-sized city-state that had spent centuries fighting sporadic border wars with its neighbor Lagash. These weren't the grand conflicts that would later define imperial warfare. They were petty disputes over irrigation rights, trade route access, and regional prestige. But Lugalzagesi recognized that the era of petty conflicts was ending. The Sumerian world was becoming too crowded, too competitive, and too technologically advanced for small-scale politics to remain viable. His first breakthrough was organizational rather than military. While other city-states still relied on seasonal armies of citizen soldiers, Lugalzagesi created Sumer's first truly professional military force. His soldiers trained year-round, fought with standardized equipment, and received regular pay that freed them from the need to return home for planting and harvest seasons. This meant Umma could conduct sustained campaigns that exhausted enemies who had to rotate their forces according to agricultural schedules. More importantly, Lugalzagesi understood that military victory was meaningless without administrative follow-through. Conquered cities had to be governed, not just occupied. Defeated enemies had to be integrated into productive relationships, not simply exploited until they rebelled. Victory in battle was only the beginning of imperial success. His solution was systematic cultural integration. When Lugalzagesi conquered a city, he didn't destroy its temples or eliminate its ruling class. Instead, he incorporated local deities into a broader religious hierarchy with Sumerian gods at the top. He retained local administrators but placed them under the supervision of Umma officials. He preserved local laws but established Umma courts to handle serious crimes and political disputes. He encouraged intermarriage between Umma colonists and local populations, creating mixed communities with loyalty to both local traditions and imperial authority. This wasn't benevolent multiculturalism. It was sophisticated social engineering designed to minimize resistance while maximizing extractable resources. But it worked. Within a generation, conquered territories were contributing more to the empire through willing cooperation than they had ever produced through coercive exploitation. The key insight was economic. Lugalzagesi recognized that forced tribute was far less valuable than voluntary trade. A city that paid taxes grudgingly while plotting rebellion was a net drain on imperial resources. A city that participated enthusiastically in imperial trade networks while feeling secure in its cultural identity was a generator of wealth that benefited everyone involved. So he built the world's first free trade zone. The Lugalzagesi Empire abolished internal tariffs, standardized weights and measures, guaranteed safe passage for merchants, and established imperial courts to resolve commercial disputes. A trader could travel from the mountains of Iran to the cedars of Lebanon, carrying a single currency, operating under a single legal system, and protected by a single military force. The economic efficiency gains were enormous. Transaction costs plummeted. Trade volumes exploded. Prosperity increased throughout the empire, not just for ruling elites, but for ordinary merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. The results were visible in every major city. Ur's royal cemetery, dating from this period, contains grave goods imported from regions thousands of kilometers away. Gold from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, silver from the Taurus Mountains, exotic woods from the Indian Ocean. These weren't just luxury items for royal display. They were evidence of trade networks that could move high-value goods efficiently across vast distances. But the empire's most impressive achievement was technological diffusion. Innovations developed in one region spread rapidly throughout the imperial system, accelerating the pace of development everywhere. Metallurgical techniques perfected in mountain workshops reached Sumerian cities within months rather than decades. Agricultural methods proven successful in one climate were quickly adapted to different environments. Engineering solutions developed for specific local problems became standardized practices that improved infrastructure throughout the empire. The capital city of became a cosmopolitan center that rivaled anything the world would see again for over 1,000 years. Its population included Sumerians, Akkadians, Elamites, mountain peoples from the Zagros, desert nomads from the west, and merchants from as far away as the Indus Valley. Its workshops produced goods combining techniques from dozens of different traditions. Its schools taught languages, mathematical systems, and legal codes that reflected the diversity of the empire's constituent peoples. Most remarkably, the empire developed the world's first professional diplomatic service. Lugalzagesi's officials weren't just administrators. They were trained negotiators who could operate effectively in different cultural contexts, speak multiple languages, and understand the complex motivations of diverse peoples. They established permanent embassies in major cities, maintained regular communication with frontier governors, and coordinated imperial policy across territories that spanned multiple climate zones and economic systems. This diplomatic sophistication enabled the empire to expand through negotiation as often as through conquest. Many cities joined the imperial system voluntarily after calculating that the benefits of membership outweighed the costs of resistance. Trade access, military protection, technological exchange, and administrative support were powerful incentives that made imperial integration attractive even to peoples who could have maintained independence. But the empire's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability. The same administrative sophistication that enabled efficient governance across vast territories also created dependencies that made the system fragile. Imperial cities relied on grain imports from distant agricultural regions. Imperial armies depended on supply networks that stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Imperial communication required messenger systems that could be disrupted by relatively small groups of determined enemies. Most critically, the empire's legitimacy rested on its ability to deliver prosperity and security to its diverse peoples. As long as trade flowed freely, disputes were resolved fairly, and external threats were defeated decisively, the imperial system commanded willing obedience. But any significant failure in performance could trigger cascading rebellion that would be impossible to suppress with available military resources. By 2300 BCE, that failure was becoming inevitable. The empire's success had attracted the attention of peoples beyond its borders who saw imperial wealth as an irresistible target for conquest. To the north, Akkadian tribes led by an ambitious king named Sargon were developing military techniques specifically designed to defeat Sumerian armies. To the east, Elamite kingdoms were forming alliances aimed at breaking Sumerian control over trade routes to the Iranian plateau. To the west, nomadic peoples displaced by climate change were being forced into territories that brought them into direct conflict with imperial frontier settlements. The empire faced a classic strategic dilemma. It was too large to defend everywhere simultaneously, but too valuable to abandon anywhere voluntarily. Imperial armies could defeat any single enemy, but they couldn't fight multiple enemies in different theaters while maintaining internal security and protecting vital supply lines. Lugalzagesi's solution was characteristically ambitious, preemptive expansion. If the empire couldn't defend its existing borders, it would push those borders outward until they reached natural barriers that were easier to defend. The Zagros Mountains to the east, the Syrian Desert to the west, the Taurus Mountains to the north, the Persian Gulf to the south. This meant conquering territories that had never been part of the Sumerian cultural sphere, integrating peoples who shared no common traditions with existing imperial populations, and governing regions that were too distant for effective oversight with available communication technology. The imperial expansion campaigns of 2320 to 2300 BCE were the largest military operations in human history up to that point. Lugalzagesi mobilized armies totaling over 60,000 soldiers, a force larger than most entire city populations. His logistics network included thousands of support personnel, hundreds of supply wagons, and permanent depots positioned along major campaign routes. His intelligence service provided detailed information about enemy territories, military capabilities, and political relationships that enabled strategic planning on an unprecedented scale. The campaigns succeeded brilliantly in military terms. Imperial armies defeated every enemy they encountered, occupied every territory they targeted, and established administrative control over regions that doubled the empire's size. But military success created administrative challenges that proved impossible to solve with available resources. The newly conquered territories were too large, too diverse, and too hostile for the integration methods that had worked successfully in the Sumerian heartland. Local populations had no cultural connection to Sumerian traditions, no economic incentive to cooperate with imperial administration, and no reason to believe that imperial rule would benefit their communities. Military occupation was expensive, culturally destructive, and politically destabilizing. But withdrawal would invite rebellion that could spread to other imperial territories. Lugalzagesi found himself trapped by his own success. The empire had become too large to govern effectively, but too valuable to abandon voluntarily. The end came with shocking suddenness. In 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad launched a coordinated assault on multiple imperial territories simultaneously. While Lugalzagesi's armies were scattered across distant frontiers, Akkadian forces struck directly at the empire's heartland, capturing key cities before imperial forces could respond effectively. The Battle of Uruk, fought in 2334 BCE, lasted less than a day. Lugalzagesi's elite guard, caught unprepared for siege warfare, was overwhelmed by Akkadian forces using innovative tactics that Sumerian commanders had never encountered. Lugalzagesi himself was captured, paraded through Akkadian cities in a wooden cage, and eventually executed in a public ceremony designed to demonstrate that the age of Sumerian dominance was over. But the empire's collapse revealed something remarkable. The imperial system had created lasting changes that survived political defeat. The trade networks, legal institutions, technological innovations, and cultural exchanges that the empire had fostered continued to operate even after imperial authority disappeared. Cities that had been conquered continued to use imperial administrative techniques. Merchants continued to operate according to imperial commercial practices. Craftsmen continued to employ imperial technological standards. Lugalzagesi had failed to create a lasting political empire, but he had succeeded in creating something more important, the template for civilization that would define human development for the next 4,000 years. The concepts of professional military service, bureaucratic administration, economic integration, diplomatic negotiation, and cultural exchange that his empire had pioneered became standard features of every subsequent imperial system. Most importantly, the empire had demonstrated that human beings could cooperate across vast distances and cultural differences to create prosperity and security on a scale that individual communities could never achieve alone. The political structure had collapsed, but the idea of empire, the possibility of transcending local limitations through organized cooperation, had been proven viable. The Akkadians who conquered Lugalzagesi's empire didn't destroy the Sumerian legacy. They adopted it, adapted it, and expanded it. The future belonged not to any single people, but to whoever could most effectively organize the cooperative potential that the Sumerians had discovered. The age of city-states was ending. The age of empires had begun. The copper mine at Timna, in what is now southern Israel, still bears the scars of ancient extraction. Shafts descend 30 meters into solid rock, following veins of ore that Sumerian miners pursued with bronze tools and desperate determination. The slag heaps outside contain enough metal residue to build a modern skyscraper, evidence of industrial production on a scale that wouldn't be matched again for 3,000 years. This was where the future began. Around 3000 BCE, Sumerian metallurgists made a discovery that would transform human civilization more profoundly than the invention of writing or the development of agriculture. They learned to combine copper with tin to create bronze, an alloy harder than either component metal, more durable than stone, and capable of holding an edge sharp enough to cut through leather, wood, and even inferior metals. Bronze changed everything. The transformation started in the workshops of Sumerian temples, where craftsmen had been experimenting with metalworking techniques for centuries. Early Sumerian tools were made from pure copper, which was soft enough to shape easily, but too weak for demanding applications. Copper knives dulled quickly, copper weapons bent in combat, copper agricultural tools wore out after a single growing season. The addition of tin, just 10% of the total mixture, created a material with completely different properties. Bronze tools could be sharpened to razor edges that stayed sharp through months of use. Bronze weapons could penetrate armor and shields that had been impregnable to earlier materials. Bronze agricultural implements lasted for years while maintaining their effectiveness. But the real revolution wasn't technological. It was economic. Bronze production required resources that no single region possessed. Copper ore was relatively common throughout the Middle East, but tin was rare and geographically concentrated. The closest significant tin deposits to Sumer were in the mountains of Anatolia, over 1,000 kilometers away. Other sources were even more distant: Central Asia, Western Europe, or the mysterious Tin Islands that some scholars identify with Britain. This meant that bronze production required trade networks spanning continents, transportation systems capable of moving heavy cargo across dangerous terrain, and financial arrangements sophisticated enough to coordinate transactions between parties who might never meet face to face. A Sumerian metalworker couldn't simply walk to a nearby mine and dig up the materials needed for his craft. He had to participate in a global economy. The Sumerians rose to the challenge with characteristic ingenuity. They developed the world's first international trade networks, sending merchant expeditions to distant regions and establishing permanent trading posts in strategic locations throughout the known world. Sumerian merchants reached the Indus Valley in the east, Anatolia in the north, and the shores of the Persian Gulf in the south, creating commercial relationships that would persist for over 1,000 years. These weren't simple buying and selling relationships. They were complex partnerships that involved technology transfer, cultural exchange, and political cooperation between very different peoples. Sumerian merchants didn't just purchase raw materials. They taught local populations advanced mining techniques, introduced new agricultural methods, and shared innovations in transportation and communication that benefited everyone involved. The famous merchant archive from Kanesh in central Turkey provides detailed documentation of how these relationships worked. Sumerian traders established permanent offices in local cities, married into local families, learned local languages, and became integrated members of local communities while maintaining their connections to Sumerian homeland markets. They weren't colonial exploiters extracting resources from subject peoples. They were international businessmen, creating mutually beneficial relationships that generated prosperity for all participants. The profits were enormous. Bronze tools were so superior to earlier alternatives that they commanded premium prices throughout the ancient world. Farmers would pay almost any price for plows that could break ground that stone tools couldn't touch. Warriors would sacrifice other necessities to obtain weapons that could defeat enemies equipped with inferior materials. Craftsmen could afford expensive bronze tools because those tools enabled them to produce goods of higher quality and greater value than previously possible. The technological advantages multiplied across every aspect of Sumerian life. Bronze agricultural tools enabled farmers to cultivate marginal lands that had been too difficult to work with stone implements. Bronze weapons gave Sumerian armies decisive advantages over enemies still fighting with copper or stone armaments. Bronze crafting tools allowed artisans to work with materials and achieve precision that earlier technology couldn't match. Most importantly, bronze production required social organization on an unprecedented scale. Mining operations had to be coordinated across vast territories. Transportation networks had to be maintained despite political instability and geographical obstacles. Quality control had to be enforced across supply chains, involving dozens of intermediate steps and multiple cultural contexts. This drove the development of the world's first multinational corporations. Sumerian temple complexes evolved from local religious institutions into international business enterprises with operations spanning the known world. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur maintained trading posts from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean, employed thousands of merchants and support personnel, and coordinated activities that affected the economies of dozens of different regions. These temple corporations developed sophisticated management techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the Roman Empire. They used standardized accounting methods that could track transactions across multiple currencies and legal systems. They employed professional managers who could operate effectively in different cultural contexts. They maintained communication networks that could coordinate policy decisions across thousands of kilometers, despite the limitations of ancient transportation technology. The economic integration had profound cultural consequences. For the first time in human history, peoples separated by vast distances and major cultural differences found themselves participating in shared economic activities that required ongoing cooperation and mutual understanding. Sumerian merchants learned foreign languages, adapted to foreign customs, and developed appreciation for foreign achievements that gradually broke down the ethnic prejudices that had characterized earlier periods. This cosmopolitan outlook influenced every aspect of Sumerian culture. Art began incorporating motifs from distant regions. Architecture adopted techniques developed by foreign peoples. Literature included stories and characters from non-Sumerian traditions. The Sumerians were becoming citizens of the world rather than merely members of individual city-states. But the Bronze Revolution also created new vulnerabilities that would ultimately prove fatal to Sumerian independence. The international trade networks that made bronze production possible also made Sumerian civilization dependent on relationships with peoples beyond Sumerian political control. A disruption in tin supplies from distant mountains could cripple Sumerian military capabilities within months. Political instability in remote regions could cause economic crisis in Sumerian cities. Military conflicts between foreign peoples could cut trade routes that Sumerian prosperity required. Most dangerously, the same technological advantages that bronze weapons gave to Sumerian armies were also available to Sumerian enemies. Any people with access to international trade networks could acquire bronze weapons and military technology. The temporary military superiority that had enabled Sumerian expansion was gradually eroding as neighboring peoples adopted Sumerian innovations and developed counter-strategies specifically designed to defeat Sumerian advantages. By 2500 BCE, several non-Sumerian peoples had developed military capabilities that matched or exceeded those of Sumerian city-states. The Elamites to the east had learned Sumerian siege techniques and were applying them to capture Sumerian frontier settlements. The Akkadians to the north had adopted Sumerian weapons technology while developing tactical innovations that could defeat traditional Sumerian battle formations. Various mountain peoples had acquired bronze weapons through trade relationships and were using them to raid Sumerian territories with increasing frequency and effectiveness. The Bronze Revolution had created a more connected, more prosperous, more technologically advanced world, but also a more competitive and more dangerous one. The same innovations that had enabled Sumerian dominance were now enabling Sumerian enemies to challenge that dominance effectively. The crisis came to a head around 2350 BCE, when changing climate patterns disrupted the agricultural systems that supported Sumerian urban populations. A series of severe droughts reduced crop yields throughout Mesopotamia, forcing cities to compete more intensively for diminishing food supplies. At the same time, nomadic peoples displaced by the same climate changes began migrating into territories that brought them into direct conflict with Sumerian settlements. The combination of internal resource scarcity and external military pressure created exactly the kind of crisis that Bronze Age technology was supposed to prevent. Sumerian cities had the weapons and tools necessary to defend themselves and maintain their prosperity. But they lacked the political unity necessary to coordinate their response to threats that affected the entire region simultaneously. Individual city-states could defeat individual enemies, but they couldn't address systemic problems that required region-wide solutions. The very success that bronze technology had made possible, the growth of multiple powerful independent city-states, now prevented the kind of centralized response that the crisis demanded. The solution came from an unexpected source, a non-Sumerian people who had learned Sumerian techniques while developing political innovations that the Sumerians themselves had never attempted. Sargon of Akkad understood something that Sumerian rulers had missed. Bronze Age technology made imperial integration not just possible, but necessary. The economic networks that bronze production required could only be secured through political control that extended beyond individual city-states. The military capabilities that bronze weapons provided could only be fully exploited through unified command structures that could coordinate operations across vast territories. Most importantly, Sargon realized that the cultural cosmopolitanism that Bronze Age trade had created made multi-ethnic empire politically viable for the first time in human history. Peoples who had learned to cooperate in commercial relationships could learn to cooperate in political relationships, especially if imperial authority provided benefits that justified the loss of local autonomy. The Akkadian conquest of Sumer wasn't just military victory over a rival power. It was the next stage in the Bronze Age revolution, the transformation of commercial networks into political systems that could harness the full potential of metallurgical technology for human development. The Sumerians had invented bronze and learned to use it for tools and weapons. The Akkadians learned to use it for empire. But even as Sumerian political independence was ending, Sumerian cultural influence was reaching its peak. The Bronze Age networks that connected Mesopotamia to the rest of the world carried Sumerian innovations. Writing, mathematics, legal concepts, religious ideas, artistic techniques, to peoples who would preserve and develop them long after the Sumerian city-states had fallen to foreign conquest. The Bronze Revolution that began in Sumerian workshops would continue for another 1,000 years, spreading across Europe, Asia, and Africa, transforming every human society it touched. The Sumerians had started something that would outlast their own civilization by millennia. The bronze head discovered at Nineveh in 1931 stares out from museum display cases with an intensity that seems to pierce through 43 centuries. The features are sharp, commanding, unmistakably Semitic rather than Sumerian. The eyes, once inlaid with precious stones, now hollow sockets that somehow make the face more intimidating rather than less. The beard, carefully curled in the Mesopotamian royal style, frames a mouth set in an expression of absolute determination. This is believed to be the face of Sargon of Akkad, the man who ended Sumerian independence and created the world's first multi-ethnic empire. Sargon's rise to power reads like ancient propaganda, which it probably was. According to the legends he promoted, he was born in secret to a priestess who couldn't acknowledge her child. She placed him in a reed basket and set him afloat on the Euphrates River, where he was found and raised by a gardener named Aki. Through talent and determination, he rose from humble origins to become cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, king of Kish, then seized power through a combination of military genius and divine favor. The reality was almost certainly more prosaic, but no less remarkable. Sargon was probably born around 2370 BCE into the Akkadian people, Semitic-speaking tribes who had been migrating into northern Mesopotamia for centuries. Unlike the Sumerians, who built their civilization around cities and agriculture, the Akkadians maintained cultural traditions rooted in nomadism and pastoralism. They were more mobile, more militarily focused, and more politically unified than their Sumerian neighbors. Most importantly, they had been watching Sumerian conflicts for generations, learning from both sides' successes and failures. By 2340 BCE, when Sargon began his rise to power, the Sumerian city-states had been fighting each other for over a century. Their armies were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their populations demoralized by endless warfare that produced no lasting resolution. The great kings like Eannatum of Lagash and Lugalzagesi of Umma had demonstrated that no single Sumerian city could establish permanent dominance over the others, but their conflicts had also revealed the military and administrative techniques that would be necessary for successful imperial control. Sargon understood something that Sumerian rulers had missed. The age of city-state independence was ending. Bronze Age technology required resources and markets that transcended local boundaries. International trade demanded political stability across vast territories. Military security needed unified command structures that could coordinate defense against external threats while preventing internal conflicts from weakening the entire system. The Sumerians had created the components of imperial civilization: professional armies, bureaucratic administration, international commerce, technological innovation. But they had never learned to integrate these components into a unified system. Sargon would teach them. His first innovation was military. While Sumerian armies still consisted primarily of heavily armored infantry fighting in rigid phalanx formations, Sargon developed mixed units that combined infantry, archers, and cavalry in flexible tactical arrangements. His soldiers carried composite bows that could penetrate Sumerian armor at longer ranges than traditional weapons. They fought in loose formations that could adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. Most importantly, they were trained to fight as members of a unified army rather than representatives of individual cities with competing loyalties. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantages. Sumerian soldiers fought for their specific cities with limited commitment to broader strategic objectives. Akkadian soldiers fought for Sargon personally, with absolute loyalty to imperial success. When Sumerian armies suffered defeats, city contingents would withdraw to protect their own territories. When Akkadian armies faced setbacks, individual units would fight harder to maintain the reputation of the imperial force. Sargon's second innovation was logistical. Sumerian armies had always been constrained by the need to return home for agricultural seasons and by supply limitations that prevented extended campaigns far from base territories. Sargon created the first truly professional military force in history. Soldiers who served full-time, received regular pay, and were supplied by organized logistics networks that could support operations across vast distances for extended periods. This required unprecedented administrative sophistication. Sargon's empire needed to maintain supply depots along major campaign routes, coordinate transportation networks that could move equipment and provisions efficiently, and manage financial systems that could fund military operations involving tens of thousands of soldiers operating hundreds of kilometers from their home bases. The infrastructure investment was enormous, but the strategic advantages were decisive. Sargon could conduct simultaneous campaigns in multiple theaters while maintaining siege operations that lasted long enough to capture heavily fortified cities. His enemies, constrained by traditional limitations, could never match the sustained military pressure that imperial forces could maintain. The conquest of Sumer began in 2334 BCE with Sargon's attack on Lugalzagesi, who had recently unified most of the Sumerian city-states under Umma's leadership. The campaign demonstrated every advantage of Akkadian military innovation over traditional Sumerian warfare. While Lugalzagesi's forces were concentrated in defensive positions around major cities, Sargon's armies moved rapidly across the countryside, capturing supply centers, cutting communication lines, and isolating Sumerian strongholds from mutual support. Instead of attacking fortified positions directly, Akkadian forces conducted systematic devastation of agricultural areas that forced Sumerian cities to surrender or face starvation. The decisive battle occurred at Uruk, where Lugalzagesi had concentrated his remaining forces for a final stand. Sargon's composite bow units decimated Sumerian phalanxes before they could close to spear range, while Akkadian cavalry exploited gaps in enemy formations to attack from unexpected directions. The battle lasted less than a day. Lugalzagesi was captured, paraded through Akkadian cities in a wooden cage, and eventually executed in a public ceremony designed to demonstrate that Sumerian resistance was hopeless. But military conquest was only the beginning of imperial success. The real challenge was governing peoples who had no cultural connection to Akkadian traditions and no reason to believe that imperial rule would benefit their communities. Sargon's solution was systematic cultural integration combined with administrative efficiency. Unlike previous conquerors who had simply imposed their own systems on defeated peoples, Sargon created hybrid institutions that incorporated the best features of both Akkadian and Sumerian traditions, while serving imperial interests. He retained Sumerian legal codes, but established imperial courts to handle serious crimes and political disputes. He preserved local religious practices, but required recognition of Akkadian gods as supreme deities with ultimate authority over regional affairs. He maintained local economic systems, but integrated them into imperial trade networks that provided access to markets and resources that independent cities couldn't reach. Most importantly, he offered advancement opportunities that made imperial service attractive to talented individuals regardless of their ethnic background. Sumerian administrators who demonstrated loyalty and competence could rise to high positions in imperial government. Sumerian merchants who cooperated with imperial trade policies could access protected markets throughout the empire. Sumerian intellectuals who contributed to imperial culture could receive patronage and recognition that local city-states couldn't provide. This wasn't benevolent multiculturalism. It was sophisticated political engineering designed to create stakeholder loyalty among conquered populations. But it worked. Within a generation, many Sumerians viewed imperial integration as an opportunity rather than an imposition, especially when they compared their prospects under Akkadian rule to the chaos and violence that had characterized the final decades of Sumerian independence. The economic results were spectacular. Imperial unification eliminated the trade barriers, military conflicts, and political uncertainties that had disrupted commercial activity during the Sumerian civil wars. Merchants could travel from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean under single political authority, using standardized currency and protected by imperial military forces. Manufacturing centers could access raw materials and markets that independent city-states had never been able to reach reliably. The capital city of Akkad became the largest urban center in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 100,000 people. Its workshops produced goods combining techniques from dozens of different traditions. Its markets handled commodities from regions thousands of kilometers away. Its schools trained administrators, soldiers, and specialists who served throughout the imperial system. But the empire's greatest achievement was technological diffusion. Innovations developed in one region spread rapidly throughout the imperial system, accelerating the pace of development everywhere. Agricultural techniques proven successful in Mesopotamian conditions were quickly adapted to different climates and soil types. Military technologies developed for specific strategic situations became standardized practices that improved defense capabilities throughout the empire. Engineering solutions created for local problems became imperial standards that upgraded infrastructure across vast territories. Sargon's empire lasted 180 years and covered territories from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, from the Zagros Mountains to the Syrian desert. At its peak, it controlled trade routes that connected 3 continents and governed populations that included dozens of different ethnic and linguistic groups. It established the template for imperial administration that would be used by every subsequent empire in the ancient world. More importantly, it preserved and transmitted Sumerian cultural achievements to future generations. While Sumerian political independence ended with Akkadian conquest, Sumerian intellectual innovations, writing, mathematics, law, literature, religious concepts, became the foundation of imperial culture that would influence human development for thousands of years. Sargon understood that military conquest without cultural continuity produced unstable empires that collapsed as soon as military pressure was removed. By incorporating Sumerian learning into Akkadian political structures, he created a synthesis that was stronger and more durable than either component tradition alone. The empire eventually fell to internal rebellions and external invasions around 2154 BCE, but its influence continued long after its political collapse. The administrative techniques, military innovations, and cultural synthesis that Sargon had pioneered became the standard model for imperial government throughout the ancient world. The Babylonians who eventually conquered Akkadian territories used Sargon's methods to build their own empire. The Assyrians who succeeded the Babylonians adopted Akkadian administrative practices while developing their own military innovations. The Persians who conquered the Assyrians preserved Mesopotamian cultural traditions while extending imperial control across 3 continents. Every great empire in ancient history was, in some sense, an elaboration of principles that Sargon had discovered during his conquest of Sumer. The transition from city-state independence to imperial integration that he had accomplished became the fundamental pattern of political development that would define human civilization for the next 4,000 years. The Sumerians had invented urban civilization. Sargon had learned to make it work on a global scale. But even as Sumerian political independence was ending, Sumerian cultural influence was reaching new heights. The imperial system that Sargon created preserved Sumerian achievements while transmitting them to peoples who would carry them forward into the future. The next chapter of this story would be written by the Sumerians' most successful students, the Babylonians. The clay tablet trembles in the archaeologist's hands, its cuneiform inscription barely legible after 4,000 years, buried in the ruins of Nippur. But the words it preserves are unmistakable. The king is dead. The palace burns. The gods have abandoned their temples. Who will save the black-headed people? This wasn't just political crisis. It was civilizational collapse. Around 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire that had dominated Mesopotamia for over a century began to disintegrate with shocking suddenness. Within 50 years, imperial authority had vanished, trade networks had collapsed, cities had been abandoned, and the population of the entire region had declined by as much as 60%. Archaeological evidence suggests that some areas remained virtually uninhabited for decades. What had gone wrong? The immediate cause was climate change. Core samples from the Persian Gulf show that around 2200 BCE, the region experienced the most severe drought in over 1,000 years. Precipitation declined by as much as 40%. River levels dropped dramatically. Agricultural productivity collapsed throughout the Mesopotamian heartland. But climate change alone couldn't explain the extent of the catastrophe. Other regions had survived similar droughts without experiencing complete civilizational breakdown. The Nile Valley, for example, faced comparable climate stress during the same period, but maintained political continuity and cultural development despite economic difficulties. The difference was structural. The Akkadian Empire had created a highly integrated system that maximized efficiency during normal conditions, but proved catastrophically vulnerable when those conditions changed. Imperial agriculture depended on irrigation networks that required constant maintenance and regional coordination. Imperial trade relied on long-distance routes that became impassable when political authority collapsed. Imperial administration needed tax revenues that disappeared when agricultural production declined. Most critically, the empire had eliminated the local self-sufficiency that had enabled Sumerian city-states to survive previous crises. Cities that had once maintained their own food stores, water supplies, and defensive capabilities had become dependent on imperial systems that couldn't function during emergencies. When those systems failed, entire urban populations faced starvation, disease, and military vulnerability simultaneously. The human cost was enormous. Excavations at sites throughout Mesopotamia reveal evidence of massive population decline, widespread malnutrition, and social breakdown that persisted for decades. Cuneiform records from the period describe cities where the dead outnumbered the living, where survivors fought over scraps of food, where parents sold their children into slavery to buy grain for a few more days of life. But the crisis also revealed something remarkable about human resilience and cultural continuity. Even as imperial authority collapsed and urban populations fled or died, small groups of survivors preserved the essential elements of Mesopotamian civilization. Scribes continued copying literary texts even when they had no political institutions to serve. Priests maintained religious traditions even when their temples had been abandoned. Craftsmen preserved technical knowledge even when they had no markets for their products. Most importantly, these survivors remembered what had worked before the crisis and began experimenting with ways to recreate successful institutions under changed conditions. The revival began around 2100 BCE in the southern city of Ur, where a local governor named Ur-Nammu declared independence from whatever remained of Akkadian authority and began rebuilding Sumerian political traditions adapted to post-imperial realities. Ur-Nammu's approach was deliberately conservative. Instead of trying to recreate the Akkadian Empire's centralized structure, he focused on restoring the city-state system that had provided stability and prosperity during Sumer's classical period. But he incorporated lessons learned from both imperial success and imperial failure to create something more durable than either the original Sumerian city-states or the Akkadian imperial system. The key innovation was federal cooperation. Instead of viewing neighboring cities as rivals to be conquered or allies to be dominated, Ur-Nammu developed relationships based on mutual benefit and shared responsibility. Cities maintained their local autonomy, but coordinated their policies on matters of regional importance: flood control, trade route security, military defense against external threats. This wasn't empire, it was confederation. Cities joined voluntarily because cooperation served their interests better than independence, and they could withdraw if confederation policies no longer benefited their populations. The system preserved local identity and decision-making authority while providing the coordination necessary for large-scale projects that individual cities couldn't accomplish alone. The results were impressive. Within 2 generations, the Ur Third Dynasty, as historians now call it, had restored prosperity and stability throughout southern Mesopotamia. Agricultural production recovered to pre-crisis levels. Trade networks were re-established. Population growth resumed. Urban construction projects rivaled the great achievements of earlier periods. Most remarkably, the revival produced a flowering of Sumerian culture that exceeded anything from the classical period. Literature, mathematics, law, and religious thought all reached new levels of sophistication during the Ur-III period. The Epic of Gilgamesh was edited into its canonical form. Mathematical techniques were developed that wouldn't be rediscovered elsewhere for over 1,000 years. Legal codes were created that influenced jurisprudence throughout the ancient world. But the greatest achievement of the Ur-III period was educational. The revival had demonstrated that civilizational continuity depended on preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations and political upheavals. The Sumerians responded by creating the world's first comprehensive educational system, designed not just to train administrators and specialists, but to ensure that essential cultural knowledge would survive future crises. Sumerian schools during this period taught much more than literacy and numeracy. Students learned history, literature, mathematics, astronomy, law, music, and religious traditions that connected them to their cultural heritage while preparing them to contribute to ongoing cultural development. The curriculum was deliberately broad and deep, designed to create educated citizens who could maintain civilization even if political institutions failed. The educational system also served as a cultural transmission mechanism that spread Sumerian learning throughout the region and beyond. Students came to Sumerian schools from many different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, learned Sumerian traditions, and returned to their home communities as cultural ambassadors who carried Sumerian innovations to peoples who had never been part of the Sumerian political system. This was how Sumerian civilization transcended the limitations of Sumerian political power. Even as the city-states declined in military and economic importance, Sumerian cultural influence continued to expand, shaping the development of peoples who would eventually dominate Mesopotamia politically, but would remain Sumerian intellectually. The most important of these peoples were the Babylonians. Babylon had been a minor city during the classical Sumerian period, notable mainly for its strategic location at the intersection of major trade routes. But as Sumerian political power waned during the late Ur-III period, Babylonian rulers began adopting Sumerian governmental, legal and cultural institutions while developing their own military and administrative innovations. The key figure was Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BCE and transformed it from a regional power into the dominant force in Mesopotamia. But Hammurabi's success depended entirely on Sumerian foundations. His famous law code was based on Sumerian legal precedents. His administrative system used Sumerian bureaucratic techniques. His cultural policies promoted Sumerian literary and religious traditions. Most tellingly, Hammurabi's royal inscriptions were written in Sumerian, even though he was ethnically Amorite, and his subjects spoke primarily Akkadian. Sumerian had become the language of legitimate authority, legal wisdom, and cultural sophistication throughout Mesopotamia, regardless of political boundaries or ethnic identities. This pattern would persist for over 1,000 years. The Assyrians who conquered Babylon preserved Sumerian traditions while developing their own imperial innovations. The Persians who conquered Assyria maintained Mesopotamian administrative practices that were fundamentally Sumerian in origin. Even the Greeks and Romans who eventually dominated the Middle East incorporated Sumerian mathematical, astronomical, and legal concepts into their own cultural systems. But the Ur-III revival also revealed the ultimate limitations of city-state civilization. Federal cooperation could provide regional stability and cultural continuity, but it couldn't generate the military power necessary to resist determined enemies with superior resources and unified command structures. The end came around 2000 BCE when Elamite armies from the Iranian plateau launched coordinated attacks on multiple Sumerian cities simultaneously. The federal system that had provided prosperity during peacetime proved inadequate during military crisis. Individual cities focused on defending their own territories rather than coordinating regional resistance. The Confederate military forces were defeated piecemeal by enemies who concentrated superior numbers against isolated targets. The last king of Ur, Ibisin, was captured and carried off to Elam, where he died in captivity. The city itself was sacked and partially destroyed. Most of the population was killed, enslaved, or dispersed. The political independence that Sumerians had maintained for over 1,500 years ended forever. But Sumerian civilization didn't end with Sumerian political independence. The cultural achievements that the revival period had preserved and systematized continued to influence human development long after the city-states had fallen to foreign conquest. The educational institutions that had trained generations of students continued to operate under new political authorities. The intellectual traditions that had been developed over centuries of experimentation continued to evolve under different ethnic and linguistic auspices. Most importantly, The revival had demonstrated that civilizational values could transcend political boundaries and survive political disasters if they were properly preserved and transmitted. The Sumerians had learned to make their culture portable in ways that ensured its survival, regardless of political circumstances. This was their greatest achievement, not the creation of lasting political institutions, but the development of cultural traditions that would outlast any particular political system. The Sumerians had discovered how to make civilization immortal even when individual civilizations remained mortal. The legacy would prove more durable than anyone could have imagined. Sumerian cultural influence would persist throughout the ancient world, shaping the development of every subsequent civilization in the region. The mathematical techniques, legal concepts, literary traditions, and religious ideas that the Sumerians had developed would continue evolving for thousands of years, ultimately contributing to modern civilization in ways that we're still discovering. The city-states were gone, but the culture they had created was just beginning its global expansion. In a temperature-controlled vault beneath the British Museum, thousands of clay tablets sit in protective cases, their cuneiform inscriptions as crisp as the day they were fired 4,000 years ago. These aren't just ancient records. They're the DNA of human civilization, containing the genetic code for concepts so fundamental to modern life that we've forgotten they had to be invented by someone. Property rights, legal contracts, educational curricula, mathematical systems, astronomical calendars, democratic assemblies, professional military service, international diplomacy, urban planning, industrial production, all Sumerian innovations, all still shaping how we live today. The Sumerians didn't just build the first cities. They solved the basic problems that every complex society has faced since their time. How do you organize thousands of people to work together efficiently? How do you resolve disputes fairly? How do you preserve knowledge across generations? How do you defend yourself against enemies while maintaining prosperity? How do you balance individual ambition with collective needs? Their solutions became humanity's solutions, transmitted across millennia through an unbroken chain of cultural inheritance that connects ancient Mesopotamia to the modern world. Start with writing itself. Every alphabet you've ever seen traces its ancestry back to those first cuneiform marks pressed into Sumerian clay around 3,200 BCE. The Phoenicians adapted Mesopotamian writing systems to create the first true alphabet. The Greeks modified Phoenician letters to represent vowels as well as consonants. The Romans refined Greek letters into the forms we still use today. But the real innovation wasn't the symbols. It was the concept that human speech could be captured and preserved in visual form. Once that idea existed, every human society that encountered it eventually developed its own writing system, regardless of cultural barriers or geographic distance. The Chinese, the Maya, the peoples of the Indus Valley, all independently discovered that writing was possible because the Sumerians had already proven it could be done. The implications rippled forward through every aspect of human development. Science became possible because observations could be recorded and verified. History became possible because events could be documented and transmitted. Literature became possible because stories could be preserved and refined. Law became possible because rules could be codified and consulted. Education became possible because knowledge could be systematized and taught. Without Sumerian writing, human civilization would have remained forever limited by the constraints of memory and oral tradition. Complex societies would have been impossible. Technological advancement would have been glacially slow. Cultural achievement would have died with each generation of practitioners. The Sumerians didn't just give us writing, they gave us the future. Their mathematical innovations were equally transformative. The base 60 numerical system they developed is still used today for measuring time and angles, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't arbitrary conventions. They're Sumerian discoveries that proved so useful that every subsequent civilization adopted them. More importantly, the Sumerians invented the mathematical concept of place value. The idea that a symbol's meaning depends on its position within a larger numerical expression. This seems obvious today, but it was a conceptual breakthrough that made complex calculation possible for the first time in human history. Without place value, you can't do multiplication or division efficiently. You can't solve algebraic equations. You can't develop geometry or astronomy or engineering. The mathematical techniques that Sumerian priests developed for calculating temple construction, agricultural yields, and astronomical cycles became the foundation for all subsequent mathematical development. Greek geometry, Islamic algebra, Renaissance calculus, modern statistics, all built on Sumerian numerical concepts that are still taught in elementary schools today. Their legal innovations were perhaps even more influential. The concept of written law that applies equally to all citizens, regardless of social status, was a Sumerian invention. Before Sumer, justice was personal and arbitrary. Whoever had more power won disputes through violence or intimidation. The Sumerians created the radical idea that rules could be established in advance, written down for everyone to see, and enforced consistently regardless of who was involved. This wasn't just about fairness, it was about predictability. Merchants needed to know that contracts would be enforced before they would invest in long-distance trade. Farmers needed to know that property rights would be respected before they would invest in land improvement. Craftsmen needed to know that technical specifications would be maintained before they would invest in advanced tools and training. Written law made economic complexity possible by creating the trust relationships that complex societies require. Without Sumerian legal concepts, market economies couldn't function, international trade couldn't develop, and technological innovation couldn't flourish. The Code of Hammurabi, often called the first comprehensive legal system, was actually a Babylonian adaptation of Sumerian legal precedents that had been developed over centuries of practical experience. Roman law, which forms the basis of legal systems throughout the modern world, incorporated principles that Roman jurists had learned from Mesopotamian sources that traced their ancestry back to Sumerian innovations. Every time you sign a contract, buy property, or appeal a legal decision, you're participating in systems that the Sumerians invented. Their urban planning concepts shaped every subsequent city in human history. The Sumerians discovered that large populations couldn't be managed through informal social relationships. They needed formal institutions, systematic organization, and professional administration. They figured out how to supply clean water to thousands of people, how to manage waste disposal, how to regulate markets, how to maintain public order, how to coordinate construction projects involving multiple specialized trades. More importantly, they learned how to make cities attractive places to live rather than merely efficient places to work. Sumerian cities included public spaces for recreation and social interaction, religious complexes that served as community centers, markets that functioned as cultural meeting places, and residential areas that provided privacy and comfort for individual families. The urban design principles they developed, mixed-use neighborhoods, public transportation systems, centralized utilities, systematic street layouts, building codes that ensure safety and health, are still used by city planners today. Every modern city is, in fundamental ways, an elaboration of concepts that the Sumerians pioneered. Their political innovations were equally lasting. The Sumerians invented democracy, not the modern version where everyone votes, but the original concept that political decisions should be made through collective deliberation rather than individual decree. Sumerian city assemblies included citizens from different social classes and economic backgrounds who debated policy issues and selected leaders through formal procedures. They also invented republicanism, the idea that government authority comes from the people rather than from divine appointment or hereditary privilege. Sumerian kings ruled as elected officials who could be removed from office if they failed to serve their citizens' interests effectively. These concepts traveled through Greek city-states to Roman republicanism, to modern democratic systems that govern most of the world today. The constitutional principles, electoral procedures, and governmental structures that we consider essential features of civilized society all trace their intellectual ancestry back to innovations that Sumerian political thinkers developed. But perhaps their most important legacy was cultural rather than institutional. The Sumerians discovered that human beings could transcend the limitations of individual lifespans by participating in ongoing cultural traditions that preserved and developed knowledge across generations. They created the first schools, not just to train specialists, but to ensure that essential cultural knowledge would survive political upheavals and social changes. They developed the first libraries, not just to store information, but to make it accessible to future generations who would need it to solve problems that couldn't yet be anticipated. They established the first scholarly traditions, not just to satisfy curiosity, but to create ongoing processes of investigation and discovery that would continue indefinitely. Most importantly, they realized that cultural continuity required active transmission rather than passive preservation. Knowledge had to be taught, learned, practiced, and applied by each generation, or it would be lost, regardless of how carefully it was recorded. Cultural traditions had to evolve and adapt to new circumstances, or they would become irrelevant despite their historical significance. This insight created the educational systems, scholarly institutions, and intellectual traditions that have enabled human knowledge to accumulate across millennia instead of starting over with each generation. Without Sumerian educational concepts, every human society would still be limited to whatever discoveries individual lifetimes could achieve. The Sumerians didn't just create the first civilization. They figured out how to make civilization itself a permanent feature of human development, rather than a temporary achievement that would disappear when specific political systems collapsed or particular ethnic groups declined. Their cultural synthesis spread throughout the ancient world, influencing every subsequent civilization that encountered it. The Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all incorporated Sumerian innovations into their own cultural systems. Islamic scholars preserved and developed Mesopotamian learning during the European Middle Ages. Renaissance humanists rediscovered classical texts that contained Sumerian concepts transmitted through Greek and Roman sources. Even civilizations that had no direct contact with Mesopotamia often developed similar solutions to common problems, suggesting that Sumerian innovations represented discoveries about human nature and social organization that were universally valid rather than culturally specific. Today, 4,000 years after the last Sumerian city-state fell to foreign conquest, we still live in a world shaped by Sumerian discoveries. We use their mathematical systems, legal concepts, urban planning principles, and educational methods. We organize our societies according to political ideas they pioneered. We preserve our knowledge through institutional traditions they established. Most importantly, we still face the same fundamental challenge that the Sumerians confronted: how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. How to maintain cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances. How to preserve what's valuable from the past while remaining open to innovation and improvement. The Sumerians didn't solve these problems permanently. No civilization ever has. But they provided tools and concepts that every subsequent generation has used to address them. Their legacy isn't a finished blueprint for human society. It's an ongoing experiment in human potential that we're still conducting today. The last cuneiform tablet was carved in 75 CE in a temple complex in Babylon that had been continuously occupied for over 3,000 years. The scribe who pressed those final wedge-shaped marks into clay probably didn't realize he was ending the longest continuously used writing system in human history. He was simply recording a routine astronomical observation, following procedures that his predecessors had used for millennia. When he finished his work and filed the tablet with thousands of others in the temple archive, an era ended. The Sumerian cultural tradition that had shaped human civilization for 4,000 years finally succumbed to the same forces that had destroyed the political independence of the city-states centuries earlier. But it took a remarkably long time to die. Even after the last Sumerian city-state fell to foreign conquest around 2000 BCE, Sumerian culture continued to influence every society that succeeded to political control over Mesopotamia. The Babylonians who conquered Sumer preserved Sumerian legal traditions, mathematical systems, and religious practices while adding their own innovations. The Assyrians who conquered Babylon maintained Mesopotamian administrative techniques that were fundamentally Sumerian in origin. The Persians who conquered Assyria incorporated Sumerian governmental concepts into their imperial system. Most remarkably, Akkadian, the Semitic language that had displaced Sumerian as the spoken tongue of Mesopotamia, was written using cuneiform script throughout its entire history. For over 2,000 years, every document, every royal inscription, every literary work, every administrative record in the region was created using writing technology that the Sumerians had invented. This wasn't just cultural inertia. Cuneiform had proven so effective for preserving and transmitting complex information that no subsequent writing system could match its capabilities until alphabetic scripts were perfected many centuries later. The same clay tablets that modern archaeologists find so cumbersome to decipher were actually more durable, more economical, and more versatile than papyrus, parchment, or early paper technologies. Sumerian influence persisted in other ways as well. Religious traditions that traced their origins to Sumerian mythology continued to evolve throughout the ancient period, influencing Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology in ways that are still being discovered by modern scholars. The flood narrative in Genesis, the creation stories in various cultural traditions, concepts of divine justice and human moral responsibility, all show clear influence from Sumerian religious thinking that had been transmitted through centuries of cultural exchange. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge that Sumerian priests had developed for practical temple administration became the foundation for Greek scientific achievements that we often consider the beginning of rational inquiry. Pythagorean geometry, Euclidean mathematics, and Ptolemaic astronomy all incorporated techniques and observations that could be traced back to Mesopotamian sources with Sumerian origins. Legal concepts that the Sumerians had pioneered continued to influence jurisprudence throughout the ancient world and beyond. Roman law, which forms the basis of legal systems in most modern countries, incorporated principles of contract enforcement, property rights, and judicial procedure that Roman jurists had learned from Mesopotamian legal traditions with clear Sumerian ancestry. Even after Alexander the Great's conquest brought Greek cultural influence to Mesopotamia in 331 BCE, Sumerian traditions proved remarkably persistent. Hellenistic kingdoms that ruled the region for 3 centuries found it more practical to adapt to existing administrative and intellectual traditions than to replace them with Greek alternatives. Greek rulers learned to read cuneiform, patronized traditional temples, and employed local scholars who preserved pre-Greek learning. The real transformation came with the rise of Christianity and Islam, religions that offered comprehensive alternative worldviews that made Sumerian traditions seem not just obsolete, but actively pernicious. Christian and Islamic scholars viewed Mesopotamian polytheism as demonic delusion, cuneiform writing as pagan superstition, and traditional learning as dangerous error that led believers away from revealed truth. Unlike previous conquerors who had adapted Sumerian traditions to serve their own purposes, Christian and Islamic authorities sought to eliminate them entirely. Temples were closed or converted to churches and mosques. Schools that taught traditional subjects were replaced with religious institutions focused on scriptural study. Scholars who preserved pre-Islamic learning were marginalized or persecuted as representatives of ignorant paganism. The process took centuries to complete, but it was eventually successful. By 600 CE, cuneiform writing had virtually disappeared. Traditional astronomical observation had been replaced by religious calendar systems. Legal practices based on Mesopotamian precedents had been superseded by religious law codes. Educational curricula that included Sumerian literary texts had been abandoned in favor of purely religious instruction. The final blow came with the Arab conquest of Mesopotamia in 637 CE. Unlike previous invaders who had maintained existing governmental systems while adding their own innovations, the Arabs created entirely new administrative structures based on Islamic principles that had no connection to local traditions. Arabic replaced Akkadian as the language of government and education. Islamic law replaced traditional legal systems. Religious schools replaced secular educational institutions. Within 2 centuries, knowledge of cuneiform writing had disappeared so completely that medieval scholars believed the wedge-shaped marks they found on ancient tablets were decorative patterns rather than meaningful text. The cultural tradition that had preserved human knowledge for 4 millennia had been so thoroughly erased that its very existence was forgotten. But erasure wasn't extinction. Even as conscious knowledge of Sumerian traditions disappeared, their influence continued through indirect channels that proved impossible for religious authorities to identify and eliminate. Mathematical techniques that had been developed in Mesopotamian temples survived in practical applications, construction, navigation, commerce, that were too useful to abandon. Legal concepts that had originated in Sumerian city-states persisted in commercial practices that were too profitable to replace. Urban planning principles that had been pioneered in ancient cities continued to influence architectural decisions that were too practical to ignore. Most importantly, the intellectual habits that Sumerian education had fostered, systematic observation, logical analysis, empirical verification, rational debate, survived in scholarly traditions that religious authorities couldn't suppress without undermining their own intellectual credibility. Islamic scholars who preserved Greek philosophical texts were unknowingly transmitting ideas that contained Sumerian elements. Christian theologians who developed systematic approaches to religious questions were applying methods that ultimately derived from Mesopotamian precedents. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical learning brought many Sumerian innovations back into conscious use, though Renaissance humanists didn't realize the ultimate origins of the ideas they were recovering. When European scholars began studying mathematics, astronomy, and law through Greek and Roman sources, they were actually rediscovering Sumerian concepts that had been transmitted through centuries of cultural intermediaries. The process accelerated during the Enlightenment, when European thinkers developed systematic approaches to scientific investigation, political organization, and social analysis that unconsciously replicated methods that Sumerian scholars had pioneered millennia earlier. The scientific revolution, democratic theory, and modern educational systems all incorporated principles that could be traced back to Mesopotamian origins if anyone had possessed the historical knowledge necessary to recognize the connections. Modern archaeology finally restored conscious awareness of Sumerian achievements, but only after their influence had already shaped every aspect of contemporary civilization. When 19th-century scholars first deciphered cuneiform writing and began translating Sumerian texts, they discovered that virtually every fundamental institution of modern society had Mesopotamian precedents that were far more sophisticated than anyone had previously imagined. The tablets emerging from archaeological excavations revealed that the Sumerians had developed mathematical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance, legal concepts that anticipated modern constitutional theory, scientific methods that prefigured experimental procedures, and educational systems that embodied principles still used in contemporary schools and universities. More profoundly, the texts showed that the Sumerians had grappled with philosophical and ethical questions that remain central to human experience today. How should individuals balance personal ambition with social responsibility? What are the obligations of governments to their citizens and of citizens to their governments? How can societies preserve valuable traditions while adapting to changing circumstances? What is the meaning of human existence in a universe that seems indifferent to human concerns? The Epic of Gilgamesh, when it was finally translated and published in the late 19th century, revealed that these eternal questions had been explored with remarkable sophistication by the world's first urban civilization. The psychological insights, moral complexity, and literary artistry of the epic demonstrated that the Sumerians had achieved levels of cultural refinement that equaled or exceeded anything produced by subsequent civilizations. But perhaps the most important discovery was that Sumerian culture had been fundamentally experimental rather than dogmatic. Unlike later civilizations that claimed to possess final answers to ultimate questions, the Sumerians had approached human problems as ongoing challenges that required continuous investigation and adaptive response. Their institutions had been designed to evolve rather than to preserve unchanging traditions. Their intellectual methods had emphasized empirical observation and logical analysis rather than appeal to ancient authority or revealed truth. This experimental approach had enabled Sumerian innovations to remain viable across millennia of cultural change because they addressed universal human needs rather than historically specific circumstances. The mathematical techniques they developed worked regardless of religious beliefs about the nature of reality. The legal concepts they pioneered promoted social cooperation regardless of cultural assumptions about human nature. The educational methods they created fostered intellectual development regardless of political ideologies about governmental authority. Contemporary civilization continues to face challenges that the Sumerians confronted. How to organize complex societies efficiently while preserving individual freedom. How to balance technological advancement with environmental sustainability. How to maintain cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances. How to resolve conflicts between competing groups without resort to violence. Their solutions weren't perfect. No human solutions ever are. But they were sophisticated, practical, and adaptable in ways that enabled them to influence human development for 4,000 years, despite repeated political upheavals, cultural transformations, and technological revolutions. The Sumerian legacy survived because it addressed fundamental aspects of human nature and social organization that transcend historical circumstances. Their innovations worked not because they reflected eternal truths about reality, but because they provided effective tools for solving problems that every complex society encounters, regardless of its particular cultural characteristics. Today, as we face global challenges that require unprecedented levels of international cooperation, technological sophistication, and cultural adaptability, we might learn from the Sumerian example. They proved that human beings could transcend tribal limitations to create civilizations that served universal human needs. They demonstrated that cultural traditions could evolve and adapt without losing their essential character. They showed that intellectual and technological achievements could accumulate across generations to create capabilities that no individual society could develop alone. Most importantly, they established that human civilization was not a fragile anomaly that might disappear at any moment, but a robust development that could survive political catastrophes, cultural upheavals, and environmental challenges if its essential principles were preserved and transmitted effectively. The Sumerians didn't just create the first civilization. They proved that civilization itself was a permanent possibility for human development, rather than a temporary historical accident. Their legacy isn't just the specific innovations they contributed to human culture, but the demonstration that human beings could consciously shape their own development through organized effort, systematic investigation, and adaptive learning. That may be their greatest gift to the future, the proof that conscious human effort can create lasting improvement in the conditions of human life, and that such improvement can be preserved and transmitted across millennia to benefit peoples who could never have been imagined by the original innovators. The clay tablets crumble, the cities lie in ruins, and the language has been dead for 2,000 years. But the future that the Sumerians made possible continues to unfold, shaped by principles they discovered and methods they pioneered in the world's first great experiment in human civilization. The story that began in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia 45 centuries ago is still being written today. Every time human beings choose cooperation over conflict, investigation over superstition, adaptation over rigid tradition, and conscious improvement over passive acceptance of existing conditions. In that sense, we are all Sumerians now. The space probe Voyager 1, humanity's most distant messenger, carries a golden record containing sounds and images chosen to represent human civilization to any extraterrestrial intelligence that might encounter it. Among those carefully selected representations of human achievement is a mathematical diagram showing the Pythagorean theorem, a discovery that traces its intellectual ancestry back to Mesopotamian temples, where Sumerian priests calculated the dimensions of ziggurats using geometric principles they developed 4,000 years before Pythagoras was born. That golden record, now traveling through interstellar space at 17 kilometers per second, carries Sumerian DNA into the cosmos. This isn't poetic metaphor, it's historical fact. Every major human achievement since the Bronze Age has incorporated elements that originated in the world's first urban civilization. The rockets that launched Voyager used mathematical calculations based on Sumerian numerical systems. The computers that guided its trajectory employed logical operations that derived from Mesopotamian problem-solving methods. The international cooperation that made the mission possible followed diplomatic protocols that the Sumerians pioneered. Even the decision to send messages to potential alien civilizations reflected characteristically Sumerian optimism about the possibility of communication across vast cultural differences, the same optimism that had enabled a collection of competing city-states to create trade networks spanning 3 continents and lasting for millennia. But the most profound Sumerian influence on modern civilization isn't technological, it's conceptual. The Sumerians invented the idea that human beings could consciously improve their condition through organized effort, systematic investigation, and cooperative planning. Before Sumer, human societies accepted their circumstances as natural or divinely ordained realities that couldn't be fundamentally changed. The Sumerians discovered that reality could be analyzed, understood, and modified to serve human purposes. This discovery transformed the human relationship with existence itself. Instead of passive adaptation to environmental conditions, active environmental modification became possible. Instead of accepting social arrangements as unchangeable traditions, conscious social engineering became feasible. Instead of viewing knowledge as fixed wisdom inherited from ancestors, ongoing intellectual development became achievable. The implications are still unfolding today. Every scientific experiment, every technological innovation, every social reform, every educational program reflects the fundamentally Sumerian assumption that human effort can produce lasting improvement in the conditions of human life. Without that assumption, modern civilization would be literally inconceivable. Consider the most distinctive features of contemporary global culture: urbanization, international trade, democratic governance, scientific research, technological development, formal education, written communication, legal systems, professional military service, and systematic agriculture. Every one of these emerged first in Sumerian Mesopotamia. Every subsequent civilization has elaborated on Sumerian innovations rather than developing completely independent alternatives. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence that the Sumerians discovered fundamental principles of social organization that remain valid regardless of historical circumstances. Human nature, technological capabilities, and environmental constraints have changed dramatically since the Bronze Age, but the basic challenges of organizing complex societies remain essentially the same. How do you coordinate the activities of thousands of people with different skills, interests, and backgrounds? How do you resolve disputes fairly without resort to violence? How do you preserve and transmit knowledge across generations? How do you defend against external threats while maintaining internal freedom? How do you balance individual ambition with collective needs? The Sumerians didn't solve these problems perfectly. No society ever has. But they developed approaches that proved adaptable enough to influence every subsequent attempt at solving them. Their solutions worked not because they reflected eternal truths about human nature, but because they addressed universal aspects of the human condition that transcend particular cultural circumstances. Modern neuroscience and evolutionary psychology have begun to explain why Sumerian innovations proved so durable and influential. Human brains evolved to manage social groups of approximately 150 individuals, the maximum number of people with whom individuals can maintain stable personal relationships. But urban civilization requires coordination among thousands or millions of people who can never know each other personally. The Sumerians discovered institutional solutions to this mismatch between human psychological capabilities and civilizational requirements. Written laws replaced personal trust as the basis for social cooperation. Professional administration replaced kinship networks as the mechanism for organizing complex activities. Market economics replaced reciprocal exchange as the method for allocating resources efficiently. Formal education replaced family instruction as the means for transmitting specialized knowledge. These institutional innovations enabled human beings to transcend the biological limitations that had previously constrained social development. For the first time in evolutionary history, humans could cooperate effectively with unlimited numbers of other humans, coordinate activities across vast distances and extended time periods, and accumulate knowledge indefinitely across generations. The Sumerians had discovered how to make human civilization scalable, capable of indefinite expansion without losing effectiveness or stability. This was perhaps their greatest achievement, not the creation of the first complex society, but the invention of methods that made complex societies permanently sustainable. The scalability they achieved is still enabling human development today. The same institutional principles that allowed Sumerian cities to grow from a few thousand inhabitants to tens of thousands now enable modern metropolitan areas to function with millions of residents. The same administrative techniques that allowed Sumerian empires to govern territories spanning hundreds of kilometers now enable modern nation-states to coordinate activities across continents. The same educational methods that allowed Sumerian schools to preserve and transmit cultural knowledge now enable modern universities to advance the frontiers of human understanding. But scalability came with costs that the Sumerians also discovered and that we're still struggling to manage. Large-scale coordination requires hierarchical organization that inevitably creates inequality between those who command and those who obey. Economic efficiency requires specialization that makes individuals dependent on systems they can't control. Cultural preservation requires institutional continuity that can become rigid resistance to necessary change. Every civilization since Sumer has faced the same fundamental tension between the benefits of large-scale organization and the costs of institutional complexity. Democratic theory, market economics, federal governance, and human rights law all represent attempts to minimize those costs while preserving the benefits, attempts that employ methods and concepts that the Sumerians pioneered. Contemporary globalization is essentially the worldwide extension of the Sumerian experiment in large-scale social organization. International trade networks, multinational corporations, global communication systems, and transnational governance institutions all follow patterns that were first established in Mesopotamian city-states. The challenges of managing cultural diversity, economic inequality, environmental degradation, and political conflict in a globalized world are fundamentally the same challenges that Sumerian rulers faced on a smaller scale. The solutions being attempted today, international law, economic integration, technological standardization, educational exchange, diplomatic negotiation, are sophisticated versions of approaches that the Sumerians developed when they first discovered that human societies could transcend local limitations through organized cooperation. But the most important Sumerian legacy may be attitudinal rather than institutional. The Sumerians were the first people in human history to view their culture as a deliberate creation rather than a natural inheritance. They understood that social arrangements were human artifacts that could be analyzed, criticized, and modified to serve human purposes more effectively. This critical attitude toward existing institutions enabled continuous improvement in ways that as purely traditional societies couldn't achieve. Instead of accepting inherited customs as unchangeable realities, Sumerians treated cultural practices as experimental solutions that should be retained if they worked well and modified if they didn't. The same experimental attitude characterizes modern approaches to social, economic, and political problems. Democratic societies regularly modify their governmental structures through constitutional amendments and electoral processes. Market economies continuously adapt to changing technological and social conditions through entrepreneurial innovation and competitive selection. Scientific communities systematically test and revise their understanding of natural phenomena through empirical investigation and theoretical development. All of these reflect the fundamentally Sumerian assumption that human institutions should be judged by their practical effectiveness rather than their traditional authority, and that ineffective institutions should be replaced by more successful alternatives regardless of their historical precedents. Perhaps most remarkably, the Sumerians anticipated that their specific cultural forms would eventually become obsolete, while their underlying principles would continue to influence human development indefinitely. Sumerian literature, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, explicitly explores the relationship between individual mortality and cultural continuity, suggesting that human achievements become meaningful precisely through their contribution to ongoing collective enterprises that transcend individual lifespans. This perspective enabled Sumerian culture to remain influential long after Sumerian political independence had ended. Unlike civilizations that sought to preserve their specific characteristics unchanged, Sumerian civilization was designed to evolve and adapt while transmitting its essential insights to whatever societies succeeded it. The strategy proved remarkably successful. 4,000 years after the last Sumerian city-state fell to foreign conquest, Sumerian innovations continue to shape human development in ways that are still being discovered and explored. Every major human achievement since the Bronze Age has built on foundations that the Sumerians established. But the most profound Sumerian influence may be yet to come. As humanity faces global challenges that require unprecedented levels of international cooperation, climate change, resource depletion, technological development, cultural integration, we may need to rediscover Sumerian insights about how diverse peoples can work together effectively while maintaining their individual identities and autonomous decision-making capabilities. The Sumerians proved that human beings could create civilizations that served universal human needs while respecting local cultural differences. They demonstrated that technological advancement and social development could continue indefinitely if institutional frameworks were designed to promote adaptive learning rather than rigid preservation of existing arrangements. Most importantly, they established that human civilization itself was not a fragile historical accident that might disappear at any moment, but a robust development that could survive political catastrophes, cultural upheavals, and environmental challenges if its essential principles were properly understood and transmitted. As we prepare for a future that may include permanent human settlement of other planets, contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, radical technological transformation of human capabilities, and social challenges that we can't yet imagine. The Sumerian example provides both inspiration and practical guidance. They showed us that human beings could consciously shape their own development through organized effort, systematic investigation, and cooperative planning. They proved that knowledge could accumulate across generations to create capabilities that no individual society could achieve alone. They demonstrated that cultural achievements could transcend the political boundaries and historical circumstances that created them. Most fundamentally, they established that the future was not something that happened to human beings, but something that human beings could create through intelligent effort and collective commitment to improving the conditions of human life. That may be their ultimate gift to us, the proof that human civilization is not just possible, but continuously improvable. Not just sustainable, but indefinitely expandable. Not just meaningful, but genuinely progressive in ways that can benefit peoples who won't be born for thousands of years. The clay tablets are silent now, crumbling in museum displays. The cities lie buried under millennia of accumulated soil. The language has been dead for 2,000 years. But the future that began in those ancient cities between the rivers continues to unfold, shaped by principles they discovered and methods they pioneered, carrying their insights forward into possibilities they could never have imagined, but somehow prepared us to achieve. In the end, that may be what it means to build something eternal. Not monuments that resist time, but ideas that transcend it.